let me take a step back for a second, because I think this is important. When I was a graduate student, I remember, as a graduate student, you've got to read everything. And I remember reading Scott Decker's Life in the Gang. And at that point was basically finished reading the book, put it down and said, well, that's me out of a job then, because he's already done it all. Because for me, I was like, how on earth can I make a contribution to the field having read that, But joking aside, that for me was the sort of template, if you will. It was that was the gold standard, at least from my perspective. And Scott's on this call and I'm embarrassing him now, but I'm deadly serious. When I was a graduate student, that for me was the kind of gold standard that I wanted to try and strive to do something toward, if that makes sense. So I was very taken with that kind of field work approach of being embedded in communities, interviewing active offenders, active gang members, getting the information direct from the source, if that makes sense. Now, as Scott will tell you about his work on Life in the Gang and his other projects in St. Louis at that time, is the most important thing is access. And you've got to have individuals who can vouch for you to get you the access you need. And so in my case, doing ethnographic field work, whether it was in London or working with Robert McLean on the Scotland project, Robert in Scotland had incredible access. He had access through gatekeepers in the community, but also access through his own kind of private and personal networks, where he had kind of friends and family who he was able to sort of say like, hey, I want to call in this favor. Can you point me in the right direction and get me connected to somebody? And in many ways, that helped us navigate some of the safety challenges of that type of work. Because when you're working with serious violent offenders, I mean, some of the individuals, particularly in the Scotland project, I thought I met a few choice characters in London, but the Scottish one was on a whole nother level. I mean, we're talking to individuals who, with a straight face were like, yeah, and then we hit him in the face with a machete. And, we firebombed his house, and then we sexually assaulted his, sister. And you're just like, wait, all at the same time? Like this, it was crazy. So from a personal safety standpoint, that helped us navigate that and feel comfortable in those spaces. But it raises those big thorny questions around the ethics of the study, because you're then leveraging those personal connections, which means you're never truly objective in that work. And that balance between objectivity and subjectivity is really important in that ethnographic work. And you start to worry about the bias that you're bringing into the work. And you start to then worry about, is that shaping my perception of this reality? And is some of that backstory what's there? And it's one of the reasons why we wrote that book, actually, from that narrative criminology standpoint, where it almost reads like, at times you could almost read it like it's fiction, even though it's not, it's fact. But we wrote it in that kind of narrative way where it was a bit of a break from the norm from a lot of kind of conventional criminological writing. Now, I say all that because that's one book, but we're here to talk about On Gangs. And what is amazingly exciting about On Gangs is I had the field work that I had done largely in the United Kingdom. You then have someone like Scott, who just has, the archive of field work that he's done, the list of places where he has interviewed gang members and so on. And then in the last 10 to 15 years, David as well. It's funny because David often gets pegged as being a quantitative researcher, and that's because he's really good with stats. But David has spent days, weeks, months, years sitting down face to face with gang members and has interviewed them in lots of different contexts throughout the United States. So here we were putting together this book, which was intended to be a kind of sweeping look at the entire state of the literature, but recognizing that we also had a whole archive of quotes, of experiences, of observations, of interview data that maybe we had used previously, or sometimes we hadn't used previously. It was on the cutting room floor from a previous project that we could bring back. And we decided to be very intentional with this book to try and illustrate the points we were trying to make with those direct quotes from gang members, because we really wanted the readers, whether it was a scholar who is well immersed in this field and in the literature, or whether it's a student who's brand new to this, to not just hear it from us three and our kind of war stories and our perspectives, but try and get it that first-hand experience of, this is the voice of the gang member telling you their experience. This is how they're living their life in their community. This is what they're observing, what they're seeing, what they're saying. And that's really important, particularly for some of those more controversial debates in the literature itself. So as we started this talk today, one of the questions was around definitions. So what we do in the opening chapter of the book is we go through the academic debate on the definitions. We cite all the studies, we look at the different definitions, we pit them off against each other, we do our homework and our due diligence. But then we say, but let's see what the gang members say about this. And then we have a whole section in that first chapter of essentially how the gang members themselves are defining their own groups in the course of the interviews. And we're drawing on interviews from London, we're drawing on interviews from St. Louis, we're drawing on interviews with prison gang members in Texas, we're drawing on experiences in Colorado. It's a diversity, it's a big palette that we're drawing from. It's a diversity of experiences. And I think that makes this book, you know, when you're trying to do this kind of big look at the literature and you're basically doing a retrospective of 100 years of gang research, as we're getting close to that Thrasher anniversary, which we were very mindful of in this work, it would be easy to just make it a sort of a textbook that just reviews the literature and says, and there it is. And what we were very intentional of doing with this book is doing that, but then also incorporating those voices so that it had that monograph feel to it, and that it felt fresh, it felt new, and it felt like we were bringing in some new perspectives as well. There's a chapter, the second chapter, on communities and gangs, which I think is one of the best chapters in the book, that really, you know, just adds a kind of a new way, a new lens of thinking about old ideas, essentially. And by weaving together those perspectives, I think we're able to achieve that. So I think we're very heavily informed by those ethnographic questions and experiences, and that we've had across the world, to be able to bring that into the book.